the Iran-Israel conflict seeming to escalate, Trump involved the United States directly. B-2 Spirit bombers dropping GBU-57 bunker buster bombs on the Fordo nuclear site as well as others. It is likely, in my opinion, that these attacks were planned from the offing. There is no way that Israel could have destroyed Iranian nuclear facilities without the assistance of these bombs and these planes, neither of which Israel has. Now, there is a very fragile ceasefire, which Trump is putting his name all over. This may be a mistake. It does not appear that either Israel or Iran are particularly committed to it. Israel has already accused Iran of breaking the ceasefire, and Iran has reciprocated. However, it does appear that Iran was dragged to the negotiating table by the strength of American air power. This is perhaps a lesson that Trump could apply to the invasion of Ukraine by Russian imperialism, but seems unwilling to. Now, I want to look briefly at the real victims of this conflict, and that is the Iranian people themselves. Iran is an ancient country with a culture that goes back millennia. In the 20th century, it was twice betrayed. First in 1953, when Operation Ajax, a joint US-British intelligence-sponsored coup d'etat, overthrew the democratically elected government of Mohammad Mossadegh, who had nationalized Iran's oil industry, much to the chagrin of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. This was the brutality of the Cold War and the zero-sum game that was played. The coup, while a temporary victory for the United States, saw wide-reaching long-term effects. And by the time that the newly installed Shah, who took autocratic powers with his installation, suffered his own revolution in 1979, Iranian civil society was destroyed, disunited, and unable to face the strength of the Ayatollah Khomeini, who took power and proceeded to destroy much of Iranian democratic society, or at least what was left following decades of repression at the hands of the Shah. Stephen Kinzer, the author of All the Shah's Men, An American Coup and the Roots of Middle East Terror, writes that the 1979 revolution was a long-term effect of the increasing repression from the Shah, who came to power as a result of the coup. That Islamic revolution brought to power a fanatically anti-American regime that has spent more than 30 years, now 40, working to undermine American interests all over the world. Mark Gasirovsky writes in Mohammad Mossadegh and the 1953 coup in Iran, what the coup did was to take out the moderate secular element of Iranian politics and enabled radical Islamists and radical leftists to emerge as key opposition factions in place of it. He adds, the coup had this big impact of essentially eliminating this pro-democracy faction, and that had a very important impact on Iranian politics in the intervening years. And what we have seen is Iranian civil society be murdered for the last 40 years. What we have seen is anybody in Iran who wants to live under anything other than a theocratic regime be imprisoned, be tortured, be abused, and be executed. Iranian civil society has tried time and time again. The first in recent years was the Green Movement between 2009 and 2010. On 12th of June 2009, the Iranian people waited. Some were nervous, some were hopeful for the presidential election results. It had been a battle between the conservative President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and the reformist Mir Hossein Mousavi. Voter turnout was extremely high, and although polling gave Ahmadinejad a slight edge, the result would create a conflagration which would leave dozens, hundreds, dead. The president was awarded 63.3% of the vote, nearly a third, nearly two-thirds, leading to calls of fraud. People took to the streets calling, "Where is my vote?" often dressed in the colour green, which was the colour of Mousavi's campaign. This escalated. Violence from the regime escalated in turn. Neda Aga Sultan was a philosophy student who took part in the protest alongside her music teacher. She was murdered by the regime to a gunshot to the chest. As she lay dying, she looked into a camera. That image was broadcast around the world because the regime had not figured on the internet. They had not realized just how fast information can spread and just how fast people can be rallied together for a cause. She was named by Time in The People Who Mattered in 2009. Bobby Ghosh wrote, "Before Neda's murder, the street protests against Iran's stolen election had been a revolution without a face, doomed to be crushed by brutal authority and eventually forgotten. But Neda's dying gaze drew the eyes of the world. We can neither look away nor forget." And tragically, Neda was not the first, and she will not be the last. Although the Green Movement did not achieve its aims of reform or revolution, what it did was clear. It destroyed any remaining echoes of legitimacy from the revolution or from the Iran-Iraq war that the regime was holding on to. The regime is now seen by most young people in Iran and the diaspora as purely illegitimate, as an occupying force. And Iran will oppress any who do not recognize clerical rule or who merely question clerical policy. 2018 as well, we had oppression of the dervish minority, which makes up around 5 million people in Iran. They're Shia Muslims, they fast, they uphold the 5 pillars of Islam, but they believe that religion and the state should be separated. That is enough for them to be seen as a threat. And thus, they are oppressed. Thus, protests happen. Thus, repression, violence, and torture follows. In 2019, you can see that these events are accelerating. Bloody Aban, or Bloody November. The Iranian regime raises the price of fuel by 50 to 200% overnight. In the protests that follow, photojournalist Hossein Fatemi gives an eyewitness account of the struggle. He says, "The protest atmosphere in the streets was very intense. People were chanting slogans protesting against injustice, corruption, and poor living conditions. And as the protests intensified, security forces appeared in large numbers on the streets, attempting to control the protests by blocking roads and using tools like tear gas, water cannons, and live ammunition." The last one, for those who don't understand, bullets. He added, and this is something new, he added it was complete chaos, but there was also a complete sense of unity. The solidarity and cooperation among the protesters was huge. Some were lighting flares to counteract the tear gas. Others were dismantling security cameras in public areas and banks. Some were blocking streets. Others were destroying banks, and others were chanting slogans. And what was different about 2019 and Bloody Aban, according to the Iranian journalist Shahid Alavi, speaking to Iran International, the protesters chanted, "We do not want the reformists and conservatives. That is all over." That is a clear rejection of clerical control and the clerical regime. That, while it had been happening in the underground for decades, that to be shouted in the streets is a clear challenge to their fascism. As we have seen so often with Iran's clerical fascism, they target women because they view women as, on one hand, feeble-minded and requiring a guiding hand, and on the other, a terrible and dangerous threat. In 2022, a young woman, Masha Amani, was visiting Tehran with her brother. She was stopped by the so-called morality police because she wasn't wearing her hijab correctly. They beat her and she died. What followed was the Women Life Freedom movement, which continues in many forms to this day. People took to the streets not just in Iran, but around the world in protest against this patriarchal, misogynistic, clerical fascism. Iranian people, young Iranian people, Iran is a young country, have clearly had enough. They went out onto the streets in their hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions. We won't know until the regime falls. And what's clear on this occasion is that this time the people are done. They want the Guardian Council no longer. They want the Supreme Leader no longer. They want these po-faced serious Ayatollahs with their obsession with the destruction of Israel and attacking America no longer. They want jobs. They want freedom. They want to be able to move, to live. They want to live not as objects to be controlled by the Guardian Council, but as free men and women in a free society, to be able to have their religion as they see it, to be able to have their lives as they see them, to be able to love, live, grow, to be the Leib, not the Körper, as St. Edith Stein would tell us. These groups, these individuals, these young people coalesced into groups like the Neighborhood Youth Alliance of Iran and the Covenant. The Covenant released a charter for liberty, democracy and human rights, an enormous plan for calling for the complete abolition of the Islamic Republic, the establishment of a secular and democratic system of governance, equality for all citizens regardless of gender, religion, ethnicity or identity, freedom of choice in clothing and lifestyle. In clothing and lifestyle, simple things. Full rights for women, including the right to divorce, child custody, equal access to education and employment, and the elimination of discrimination based on gender or sexual orientation. This is the pathetic nature of the Iranian regime, that they condemn half of humanity to second-class status because of their fear and ignorance. And the Iranians have had enough of it, because Iranians are better than this, and they have been betrayed, first by my country in the United States, and then by the clerics. In response to women life freedom, the regime was typically brutal. It flirted with the idea of reforms for the first time, but it's not in its nature. I won't go into the brutality that the regime exhibited towards detainees, especially female detainees. You don't have to have much of imagination to realise what was going on, or if you want to find out, you can look at the UN's report, which will be linked below. What I'm trying to say with this brief and imperfect history of the Iranian pro-democracy movement is not to forget the trees from the forest. Right now we have a conflict that is in a very tenuous ceasefire between Iran and Israel, part of a wider conflict. The United States has attacked. Many people in my country and around the world have rallied against this. What I would ask is that when you do, and you have every right to, do not wave the flag of clerical fascism. Wave the lion and sun flag. Show your support to the enormous number of Iranians who feel so torn, but in hating the regime and feeling some vindication that its works, its attempts to build a nuclear bomb, because they were attempting to build a nuclear device, are being destroyed, and feeling a deep sense of tragedy, seeing their cities, seeing their fellow countrymen be killed in Israeli attacks. Iran wants to be democratic. They want a democracy. The thing that is holding them back is the regime. Now, in response to these attacks, I don't know what's going to happen. It could go one of two ways as I see it. Either the regime uses them as an excuse to clamp down, or this is yet another chink in the regime's rusting armour. I hope it is the latter. And I hope that the Iranian people get an opportunity to throw off and cast off the shackles of these people and start anew. Because Iran is a great nation. Iran is a great culture thousands of years old, with art, music, and literature that rivals anything the world has seen. And it is currently held hostage by small-minded clerical fascists. And we should help our Iranian brothers and sisters as much as we can, and as much as they ask us to throw off these idiots, get rid of them, so that Iran can breathe the free air once again.